Have you ever considered what might happen if you quietly withdrew? Not out of malice, not to cause harm or to make a point, but simply because something within you whispered, it's time. Time to stop pouring into spaces that never filled you back. Time to step out of roles you never asked for but carried all the same. Time to reclaim the energy you gave so freely, hoping it would return in kind, but rarely did. There's a strange kind of weightlessness in choosing to disengage. Not physically, not dramatically, just emotionally, internally, quietly. It's like unhooking yourself from a machine you didn't realize you were powering. And suddenly, as you step back, everything you held up begins to shift, falter, collapse. You begin to see how much of yourself was invested in holding others together, how many invisible threads were attached to your presence, threads they never acknowledged, but always expected. You weren't just another person in the room. You were the emotional equilibrium, the unspoken safety net, the silent container for chaos they didn't want to manage on their own. And the moment you begin to step away, not with anger but with clarity, that balance breaks. It's not that they miss you immediately. What they miss is what you did for them, what you allowed them to avoid, what you made feel easier without ever naming it. They miss the way your presence gave shape to their world. And now that it's gone, they feel something raw and unfamiliar rising inside them. Disengagement is often mistaken for detachment, but it's not indifference. It's self-respect. It's recognizing when your presence is being consumed more than it's being received. It's choosing yourself, even when it goes unnoticed, even when it's misunderstood. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away quietly. Most people don't engage with others as they are. They engage with what they represent, a role, a function, a mirror. And without even realizing it, they begin to depend on that reflection. Your presence becomes something symbolic, something stabilizing. You reflect their best traits back to them, or you carry their worst so they don't have to look. You absorb their moods, you balance their volatility. You fill the empty spaces between their confusion and their desire for certainty. You become the emotional compass they never learned to hold themselves. And then, one day, you shift. You detach. You stop showing up in the same way. Not because of resentment, but because of recognition. You realize you've been reflecting everyone else's identity so brightly, you've forgotten your own. And that's when it happens. They don't just feel your absence. They feel a disruption in the image they've created of themselves. Without your steady presence, they are forced to face what they were using you to avoid. It's not the lack of contact that unsettles them. It's the collapse of projection. People will say they miss you, but often, what they really miss is who they were able to be in your presence. You made them feel stable, worthy, validated, lovable, even if they never offered the same in return. And now, your retreat exposes the imbalance they weren't willing to see when you were still around. That's what makes your silence so difficult to bear. Because your absence doesn't just echo, it reflects. And for the first time, they have to look into a mirror that doesn't flatter, doesn't soften, doesn't adjust. For the first time, the reflection is honest. When someone has built emotional habits around your presence, your withdrawal doesn't feel like absence. It feels like collapse. At first, they can't put their finger on what's wrong. They might tell themselves you've been distant, moody, inconsistent. But deep down, what they're feeling is much more unsettling. A sudden loss of internal orientation. Because whether they admitted it or not, they had started to regulate themselves through you. You became their baseline, their compass, their quiet container for the chaos they refused to deal with. And now, with that container gone, their own emotional debris begins to rise to the surface. Some will respond with confusion, others with blame. A few might spiral, but all of them, every single one, will feel the tremor. And here's the part they rarely speak aloud. It's not that you were everything to them. It's that you were holding something invisible together. Something they didn't want to admit existed until it began to break apart. It's not uncommon for people to interpret boundaries as betrayal. When you were once a constant source of comfort, your sudden silence can feel like punishment, even if it was never meant to be. They may say you changed, that you gave up. But what really happened is far simpler. You stopped participating in the emotional illusion. The illusion that love means endless availability. That connection requires self-abandonment. That care must come at the cost of your own inner peace. What they feel now is not rejection, it's exposure. Your absence becomes a light that shines directly on all the places they've avoided within themselves. And for the first time, they have no one left to absorb the impact. This is what emotional withdrawal does. It doesn't just disrupt routine, it reveals dependency. People can't live long with a void, especially one shaped like someone they depended on. So instead of sitting with that emptiness, they begin to craft a narrative, a story, one that helps them make sense of your disappearance in a way that doesn't threaten their self-image. And in this story, you are rarely portrayed with nuance. You might become the villain, too sensitive, too distant, too cold. They'll say you overreacted, that you had unrealistic expectations, that you walked away instead of working things out. Not because these things are true, but because they're easier to believe than the alternative, that they took more than they gave, and that you finally noticed. Alternatively, you might be canonized. I didn't realize how much they did for me, they'll say. I wish I'd appreciated them more. But even that can be a deflection. Idealization is just another way to avoid responsibility. Because if you were too perfect, then your departure was inevitable, not preventable. And they don't have to change, they just have to mourn. But in both versions of the story, whether you're the selfish deserter or the saintly martyr, you're not a full person. You're a device, a plot point. Because seeing you clearly would mean seeing themselves clearly too. You will be misunderstood, you may be talked about, you may even be resented. But none of that defines you. The truth you carry doesn't need to be defended. Let them create their fiction. Let them say what they need to say to sleep at night. Because you didn't walk away to prove a point. You walked away to reclaim your peace. And that story doesn't need their permission to be true. Absence has a way of being mistaken for emptiness. When you're no longer around, people often assume you've disappeared, retreated, vanished. But what they rarely consider is this. Your absence is not a void. It is a field, a territory, a space you cleared not by accident, but by intention. And that space, though uncomfortable for them, is sacred for you. It is where your nervous system begins to breathe again, where your shoulders lower for the first time in months, where your inner voice, once drowned by constant emotional noise, finally becomes audible. You didn't retreat into nothingness. You created a space where you could exist without bending, without shrinking, without performing. It's in this space that you begin to remember what it feels like to live without being on high alert for someone else's moods, without measuring your worth through their validation, without constantly translating your needs into something more palatable for them to digest. And from the outside, they may see it as isolation, but what they're really witnessing is rerouting. You're sinking back into yourself, into the ground of your own being. You're no longer orbiting someone else's center, you've become your own. And yes, that may unsettle them. Because your withdrawal leaves behind not just silence, but reflection. Without you, they must confront the ways they relied on your constant presence to avoid their own growth. That space, it will either challenge them to evolve or tempt them to blame you for creating it. Either way, that's not your burden anymore. You've carved out a space to heal, to recalibrate, to restore. Not because you don't care, but because you finally realize that love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to be more digestible to others. Sometimes, true presence begins in sacred absence. There's something strange that happens when you start to heal. The people who once leaned on your wounds begin to call you disloyal. Not because you hurt them, but because your growth confronts their comfort. Because your evolution breaks the pact, spoken or not, that said you'd always stay where they last placed you. You'd always be who they needed. You'd always suppress just enough of yourself to keep them at ease. And then one day you stop. You start saying no. You stop over-explaining. You let the calls go unanswered. You show up in your own life without asking permission. You change, not into someone new, but into someone whole. And to those who only ever connected to your brokenness, your healing feels like abandonment. You will be accused of things you never did. You will be blamed for reactions you didn't cause. You'll hear whispers about how you've changed, and they'll say it like it's a crime. But what they're really mourning is the version of you that made their life easier. The version that sacrificed peace to keep the peace. The version that tolerated, enabled, softened, and gave until there was nothing left to give. They're not hurt because you became cruel. They're hurt because you became unavailable for the kind of connection that required your silence. Healing for you might look like less contact, more space, firmer boundaries. And for them, that shift feels like betrayal. Let it. Because if your healing threatens a relationship, that relationship was built on your inability to thrive. And if someone needs you to stay broken to feel secure, then you never had their love, only their dependency. You didn't betray anyone. You just stopped betraying yourself. There comes a point in every journey of self-reclamation when you realize something staggering. You were giving more than anyone asked for, and far more than most even noticed. Not just your time, your energy, your listening, your care, but also your silence, your restraint, your ability to absorb discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. You were the emotional shock absorber, the quiet translator of conflict, the hidden architect of harmony. You gave and gave and gave, until giving no longer felt like generosity, but like erasure. And the deeper truth is this: many people loved what you gave them, but not who you were when you weren't giving. They valued the resource, not the source. They appreciated the effect, but never stopped to ask about the cost. You became necessary but not seen, needed but not known. And now, in your absence, they're not sure how to relate to you anymore. Because you're no longer giving from depletion. You're no longer performing care out of guilt. You're no longer confusing availability with connection. They can't reach you in the same way, because you've stopped handing them the map to access parts of you they never earned. And here's what they may never admit. You made it look easy. You made it easy to feel supported, understood, safe. And now that you've stepped back, they're just beginning to realize how much of their emotional foundation was quietly built on your effort. But you were always more than your usefulness. You were never meant to be defined by what you could do for others. You were meant to exist fully, to feel deeply, to be received as a whole person, not a utility. And now you finally are. Letting go is rarely graceful. It's rarely understood. It often comes wrapped in misunderstanding, silence, projection, even resentment. And yet, it is one of the most liberating acts you will ever offer yourself. Because letting go isn't about cutting people off with coldness or pride. It's not about superiority or punishment. It's about release, about reclaiming the parts of you that were spread too thin across spaces where you were more maintenance than meaning. You don't let go because you hate them. You let go because you no longer wish to abandon yourself. You let go because clinging to old versions of connection, those that required you to betray your boundaries, your instincts, your voice, feels heavier than walking away ever could. You let go because staying started to cost you your clarity. And yes, they may never thank you. They may never understand. In fact, your exit might become the beginning of their story, not yours. A chapter they tell over dinner tables or in therapy, where you are described in pieces. The distant one, the cold one, the person who just stopped caring. But you will know better. You will know the care was there all along, but you simply stopped offering it in a way that hurt you. You stopped bleeding quietly to keep the peace, and you chose instead to live in the light of your own integrity. This is not the end of love, it is its evolution. Because real love, whether toward others or yourself, doesn't ask you to disappear to be worthy. Letting go isn't loss. It's arrival. Arrival in your own life, your own voice, your own truth. And in that arrival, you finally become free. You're not here by accident. If you're ready to question deeper, to confront the shadow and to turn discomfort into clarity, subscribe to this channel. Transformation starts here.